message from our sponsor, I think. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ben Data, CEO of Food Maven and a Denver Startup Week co-founder. Denver Startup Week has always been about community. And today, it's more important than ever to show how we can come together to create opportunities out of the challenges that we face. Opportunities for every member of the community. Before we dive in, we want to say a special thank you to our 2020 Denver Startup Week sponsors who make it all possible. Thanks to our title sponsors, Downtown Denver Partnership, JP Morgan Chase, Prologis, and Zero. And our track sponsors who have made all the great content you're hearing today possible. Battery 621 and the Public Works, Capital One Cafe, Colorado Lending Source, Friday Health, Quizlet, Exactly, Zayo, and Zestful. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement this week. Thank you to Wix, Kenzen, MAPR Agency, Obsidian HR, Kickstart Fund, Promontory Mortgage, Molson Coors, and Comcast. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors listed on the screen. Thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. You help make all of this possible.
All right, awesome. Thank you to all of our sponsors. And with that, I will turn this over to our session organizer. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandi Mays. I am a Chief Information Officer, Chief Customer Experience Officer, and founder at Zayo. Zayo provides mission-critical bandwidth to the world's most impactful companies, fueling innovations that are transforming our society. We recognize the importance of diversity when Zayo was founded in 2007. In 2020, our IT team is 50% female and 30% underrepresented minorities. Other correlated key metrics include 91% employee satisfaction and a world-class 62 Net Promoter Score. At Zayo, we believe that having a diverse team is the key to these impressive results. The next hour, you will hear from the world's top experts in diversity and inclusion. I am so honored to have each of you on our panel. I'll call on you in alphabetical order, and each of you can give a brief introduction. Harry, you get to go first.
Thank you, Sandi. My name is Harry Hollins. I am CEO of the Hollins Group, a mergers and acquisition and strategy advisory firm. And prior to that, I spent over 20 years predominantly in the technology sector in various C-level positions in corporate and business development, legal and human resources. I'm honored to be part of this important discussion. This discussion is timely and also one that's very personal to me as one of the few people of color to make it to the C-suite, and we need many more minorities and women in that boardroom because diversity improves business performance, but it also makes us better individuals and contributors to society. So I look forward to today's discussion.
Awesome. Joelle, you're next.
Thanks, Sandi, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joelle Martinez, and for the last 6 years, I've served as the Executive Director of the Latino Leadership Institute. Prior to that, I had about 15 years of experience on biz development and public affairs work, and I served mainly as a strategic consultant for both public and private organizations. Today, though, I serve as a content expert on neuroleadership, diversity, equity, and inclusion, demographic shifts, and of course, Latino professional development. The Latino Leadership Institute is a center of excellence that is working not only to prepare a new generation of our workforce through our Latino professional development programs, but we're also working with organizations directly to cultivate cultures of inclusion through our inclusion training work. And finally, we put together a lot of unrivaled research that helps us better understand demographic shifts, a changing workforce of the 21st century, and how all of these can provide opportunities for individuals and organizations to realize really the full potential of a diverse workforce. Our mission is to make sure that leadership is reflective of this growing diverse populace, and I'm thrilled, like Harry, to be part of this conversation today.
And thanks, Joelle. Katica, you're next.
Thanks, Sandi. My name is Katica Roy. I am the founder and CEO of Pipeline. Pipeline is a software platform that actually increases the financial performance of companies through closing the intersectional gender equity gap. So gender plus race and ethnicity and age. We actually started with research across 4,000 companies in 29 countries. And what we found was that for every 10% increase in gender equity toward parity, toward 50-50, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue. That became the basis for our platform. And we actually enable companies to reach equity through the decisions that they're already making for their employees: hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion.
Thanks, Katica. Pete, you're next.
Thanks, Sandi. Hi, everybody. Very happy to be here. And I'm an entrepreneur. I've started 7 companies, and I've had some certain threads run through my career, things like brand, culture, and leadership. But I think the reason Sandi asked me to be on the group is that one of the companies I started is called Greenhouse Scholars. Greenhouse Scholars is a nonprofit organization. It's been around for 15 years now. We were founded in Colorado, but now a national platform entity. And what we're doing is we're working with the highest performing young, inspiring folks from the most under-resourced communities and helping them become really capable leaders, essentially achieving their full potential. Now, in our view, that's the starting place to then go back into low resource communities and bring the thousands of other young people behind these role models from the communities. And so we've got thousands and thousands of people from all walks of life now working to make that happen. And that's a goal of ours, is to see these communities change generationally, permanently. Education's our lever. Thanks for having me, Sandi, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation too.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate it. And Stefanie, last but certainly not least.
Thank you. And thanks for having me, Sandi. I'm Stefanie Johnson. I'm a professor of management at the University of Colorado Boulder's Leeds School of Business and author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller and Wall Street Journal's September Book of the Month, Inclusify, which is harnessing the power of uniqueness and belonging to build innovative teams. And I'm super excited to be a part of this conversation because tech is honestly the future, and innovation is so key to that. And we know diversity increases innovation.
Thanks, Stefanie. With that, we'll kick off the panel. So the first question is in 2 parts, because why make it one part, right? We're there for it. First one is a no-brainer. Do you agree that we need to elevate underrepresented minorities and women into leadership positions? And if so, why is a diverse workforce important? Katica, let's kick it off to you first.
Sure. Well, the first answer is yes. That's why Pipeline exists. And what we have found is that increasing equity within companies, so both representation, but also at key pieces, so including pay, promotion rates, as well as span of control, so how many resources you control, actually impacts the revenue of companies. So it's not only the right thing to do or a social justice issue, it's actually a massive economic opportunity. And that's what we quantify and have actually collected over 1 billion data points since we started, that once you bring those lived experiences and those folks can actually be heard in those organizations, that actually is the future. And I think to Stefanie's point around tech, that is a particular concern right now because we are in the middle of the 4th industrial revolution. And we know, for instance, just looking through the gender lens, we have a 22-point gap in AI professionals, gender, and we risk baking bias into the algorithms that we're coding right now. And that's bad for everybody because it ultimately holds our economic growth back.
Super important. So Stefanie, please weigh in.
Yeah, I'm going to go out on a limb here and agree that diversity is extremely important to the future of business. And, for some of the reasons that Katica said, but it's also just the future. Like the current population is more diverse. It's going to be a majority minority country by 2025. And so we're going to have to utilize the best talent in organizations. And that means drawing from 100% of the population, not just 31%, which is the percent of white men in the US. And I think that will yield return on investment in terms of stock prices, ROI, and innovation.
Absolutely. And Pete.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that what everybody has started to talk about is obviously so critical, and our starting place is this idea of preparing these young leaders, and that means mentors, networking, connections, jobs. I think the tech piece I want to just comment briefly on. So we think about now 15 years in, hundreds and hundreds of these young folks that have been in our program that we're still working with well into their careers. And one of the things that may or may not be intuitive to folks is that there are certain careers, lots of them are business-oriented careers, tech for sure, that our folks aren't naturally inclined to get into. They haven't been exposed. So, frankly, you just take a current example with regard to how everybody's being educated right now from remote learning. Low resource populations often don't have access to the tech to even be able to attend class. That's not just in K through 12, that's in college as well. And so just think about from a career standpoint, how difficult it is for these folks to be able to understand that as an option, along with lots of other business career tracks. And so one of the things we're doing is we're trying to help through this network we've created, get all of these folks exposed to successful leaders across tech. And we've had a lot of success there, and we've actually got our first CEO of a tech company who is a graduate of Greenhouse Scholars that's now 9 years in the workforce, so a really successful Hispanic guy. So anyway, well, I think exposure is the point I'm trying to make for the younger folks. It's critical to get them that exposure and get them those networks.
And Katica, you had a weigh in on that as well.
On the networks and getting exposure. And then we need well, I was going to say, then the thing that went through my mind was then once they actually get there, we need to ensure that the system that they're in values them equitably. That's the issue that we see, both gender as well as race, ethnicity, and age, because there is an elder, there's a whole cohort of the population that's getting older. Is that and we often tell little girls this, right? That if you work hard and do well in school, you can be anything that you want to be. And then they show up in the workplace and that's not what they experience. They experience that it isn't equitable and that they face barriers from the very beginning. And that's not only an issue of fairness, it's really about economic opportunity for everyone. I mean, one of the things that we know from research is that after the 2008 Great Recession, that those companies that actually put equity at the core of their crisis management strategy actually increased the velocity of their recovery. We are now a lot worse off in the economic fallout from COVID-19 than we were in 2008. Of any time that we should be putting equity at the core of our crisis management strategy, particularly in tech, because we are in the middle of the fourth industrial revolution, which is, for those of you who may not know, the acceleration of the adoption of technology, that we should be putting equity right in the core of our strategy.
Absolutely, and I think that's a great lead in for Joelle. So Joelle, tell us a little bit about your thoughts.
Yeah, so I definitely want to focus in a little bit about demographic shifts and the shifts that have taken place over the first part of this century and what's going to take place over the next 50 years. I mean, by 2045, we are going to be a minority-majority nation. I mean, it's staggering to see year over year just how diverse our populace is becoming. But we have a saying at the LLI that demography alone does not determine destiny. I mean, if we look across leadership positions, across sectors and industries, women and definitely individuals of color are still almost invisible, to be quite frank. In fact, today, it's still close to 70% of our corporate executives in America are still white and male. So that causes us to think through what are some of those interventions, what are some of the strategies that we have been executing against over the last 60 years that equity and diversity and inclusion work have taken place, And I think it all comes down to this framework that we really, to Katica's point, I mean, we have really got to look at those barriers and have real conversations about inequities that drive the disparities, that drive us away from diversified leadership opportunities for women and for people of color. So that's some of the work we do. And I'll also point out that the economic advantage of having leaders of color that are reflective of their community have proven that you could penetrate marketplace better. You know, you're going to be more innovative, to Stefanie's point. And some of our research coming out of COVID is that the population that has been so dramatically and disproportionately impacted has been that of the Latino community. And coming after the last recession, Latinos were opening businesses at a higher rate. They were building their economic superpower. In fact, it is the third fastest growing economy in the world. So there's a lot of advantages to making sure that they're part of these conversations and that they're reflective in businesses and organizations, because those policies and strategies that we're going to need to put in place are going to be, really centered around this very growing diverse population.
Absolutely, and the good work that you're doing at the LLI is part of that how. So Harry, you're also part of the LLI in addition to your day job. So.
Yeah, I support what everyone is saying. I think there's a lot of compelling data and results around diverse companies being more successful in terms of revenue and execution and other aspects. I think one additional point I think would resonate with anyone, and that's the value of diverse perspectives. And that's what a diverse workforce gives you at every layer of a company. And those diverse perspectives allow you to see solutions and address issues from various angles. I think that's invaluable, and that's invaluable to any business leader. When you have a business issue, a business challenge, or a business opportunity, you tend to want to have a discussion with someone who has been through that same thing or something similar, or just as very thoughtful and smart, and you want very diverse perspectives, and you take that all into consideration so you can make very wise and your best business outcome, business decision, which usually drives your best business outcome.
Absolutely, and I think back to Katica's point, when you show up at a job and no one looks like you, it's a lot harder to participate day one. You're told you can be anything, you can do anything, and then you show up and it's all different. So bringing those different perspectives and allowing everyone to operate at 100%, I think is one of the huge values of inclusion and diversification. All right, the second question is the how. What do you think is the most important step we can take towards getting minorities and women into leadership positions? And Pete, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Sure. Happy to get us started. I think I've got a couple of things I'd bring up. One is a build on something that I brought up and has been discussed by others already. This idea of networks and sort of people that don't see or do see people that look like them, act like them, etc. Once you start to create diversity in the work culture, those people's networks are what then get reintroduced into that culture. So it's a self-perpetuating growth, in my view, both as it relates to racial diversity and diversity between men and women. So that's something I wanted to mention. The other thing I want to bring up actually relates to the last comment in the chat from one of the people that is listening into the panel, and it has to do with this idea of getting the right people in positions. And for me, that's about culture. And so I said I've started 7 companies. I'm the CEO of 3 companies now. Every one of those companies has more than 50% women employed at the companies and more than 50% women in C-level positions. And we significantly over-index as it relates to racial diversity as well, in terms of Black people and Hispanic people that are at these companies. And the reason why has to do with a culture that has always been assumed without any exceptions that we're looking for the best people. And we want, as part of that, this diversity of perspective that Harry mentioned. I think the best cultures, the best companies, always the most innovative companies always have that diversity of perspective, driving innovation, driving solutions. And so it's assumed at our companies that that's the company we're going to build is going to have that diversity from day one.
Absolutely. And Joelle, what do you think is the most important step?
Well, I'm gonna take us a little back in history, because I think part of this is having a little hindsight in how we got here in the first place. And you know, a lot of the language we use today and strategies we use today came out of a 1963 document, the Plans for Progress, which was actually commissioned by President Kennedy's administration right on the footsteps of the civil rights movement. And this is really the document that gave birth to the EEOC. And a lot of the framework that we work with on diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts actually stem from this very document, the terminology, the definitions. And a lot of it was based on this premise of assimilation, so that people were going to have to leave their individuality, leave their identities, check them at the door. And the only way to kind of create that is if you were willing to kind of let those things go and be part of this collective team. I fundamentally believe that that is the wrong approach. I believe that individuality is one of the key assets that the mosaic of diversity presents us all. So I think we have to understand that that framework is not the best foot forward in creating a sense of belonging, because that's what inclusion is. You know, you can be invited to join, you can show up and serve on a board, but if you don't actually believe that you belong there, all of those other steps are almost for naught. So I think it's really important that we begin to have conversations of individuality, different dimensions of diversity, and that we do better in our workplaces to acknowledge that that individuality actually brings a lot to the table.
I love that. That just makes you feel warm and happy that everyone could be part of their part of a tribe, irrespective of who you are. Katica.
So one comment about what Joelle said, and then I will answer about how we get there, is that I am actually the daughter of an immigrant and a refugee. And when my father and three older sisters are refugees, but when my father escaped from Hungary and came to the United States in 1956, actually by way of Air Force One, he changed his name to assimilate, because Laszlo Jakub was not going to be successful in America, but Leslie Jacob would. And he took English speaking lessons so that he almost didn't even have an accent. You know, in Hungarian to English is very, very difficult. But the other flip side is that he was white. You can't change the color of your skin. You can't change your gender. You know, my dad had a step up in assimilating because of the color of his skin and because of his gender. And there are things that, you can't change about who you are. Right. And so anyway, I grew up with a dad who essentially had two names, his public name and his private name. So I lived this from a very young age. How we get there, interestingly enough, and what Pipeline has found, a really key part of it is through technology. So what Pipeline, just to give you a little bit more about what we do and what we've found, is that we actually are augmented decision making. So much like you would use Google Maps or Waze to get from point A to point B, we do the very same thing, but for companies' human capital decisions. So we actually intercept HR decisions across what are essentially the 5 big buckets of decision making. So, hiring, pay, performance, potential, and promotion. We intercept those decisions and make recommendations where there's inequity. One of the things that I think is important to realize is that our systems by default are not equitable. Because if they were, we wouldn't have to do things like pay equity studies or equity audits. And what Pipeline has done using technology, and for those companies that use it, is actually to move from a system that's by default inequitable to a system that's by default equitable. So much like, a few years ago, there was talk about low 401k savings rates. What companies did was auto-enroll their new employees in 401k savings plans. So, and what happened? The savings rate went up. Why? Because I would have to unenroll. So now, by using the Pipeline platform, companies have to, individuals have to choose not to be inequitable. That's a very different paradigm than actually choosing to be equitable. I think just to break that down and what that looks like, what we have found is that a couple of things. One is that there's actually 3 key decisions that companies make across their talent each year, which is pay, performance, and potential. And for the average Fortune 500 companies that has 60,000 employees, that's 180,000 opportunities to move toward gender equity each and every year. Across the Fortune 500, that's 90 million opportunities to move toward equity. We have it within our power to actually move toward equity. So, technology is a really key part of what the solution that we can use to actually close the gap, close it at scale, and accelerate the time to closing the gap.
So really kind of solving for unconscious bias, right, Katica? I mean, I don't think anyone's choosing to not promote folks who are of color or women, but there is this unconscious bias that needs to be talked about.
Yeah, and unconscious bias doesn't make you a bad person. I mean, unconscious bias is how our brains work, right? We create patterns, which is called schema, about things. We do it about everything, and so you have to intercept that because we're actually not aware of the meaning that we are attaching to the decisions that we're making. So if you can intercept that and change it, then you can actually move people toward equity. I wanted to say one really quick thing, Sandi, if you don't mind, just on Pete's comment about culture. We found that that's a double-edged sword for diverse talent. That in actual fact, like for instance, one of the things that we found is, and I think it goes to Joelle's point about assimilation, which is that if a company has a name for someone who fits in their culture, so like a Googler at Google or a Schwabi at Schwab, that in actual fact, women are held accountable to showing those traits, right? That in order to get ahead, women have to show those traits. Men, it's nice if they do, it doesn't really matter for them to get ahead. So that cultural piece, we have to be really intentional about what that means and how we quantify it in the decisions that we're making.
Yeah, and that's what I love about your software, right? Is it's intentional and it's just unbiased. This brings us to Stefanie. You're the natural next person to speak. I absolutely fell in love with Stefanie when she showed me unconscious bias data. So it wasn't just something fluffy we were talking about, but it was real data representing it. I don't know if that's what you were going to talk about or not, but.
I don't know. I have like so many things to say after Joelle and Katica. I mean, that's what you guys are talking about, is the whole idea of Inclusify. It's that to feel inclusion, you need to belong, but you need to also have your uniqueness recognized. So inclusion is actually the overlap of uniqueness and belonging. And this is called optimal distinctiveness theory. The idea is we want to be distinct. We all want to be different, but only to the optimal level, because we also want to be accepted. And there's so much truth to the benefits of having a culture, a strong culture, if that culture is inclusive. But if the culture is designed not to be inclusive, then it's not going to increase inclusion of women and people of color and women of color. But my one thing that I tell every company I work with is look at your data, because as Sandi said, I am a total data nerd. I love data. And set goals, like benchmark against other companies. This is just like you do every day in all business operations. And then create systems to move toward your goals and ensure that you have accountability and transparency in that road to get there. And you could be tying pay to those metrics, like your ability to lead different people is essentially your ability to lead. And so if you can't lead everyone, then you're not leading effectively. So it's remarkable when you start having accountability and measuring things. People are really good at meeting goals. And especially if the company can support them in getting there. So not just say good luck, but give them strategies, maybe from pipeline or opportunities that have bear on data to show that these things work and train leaders on how to be more inclusive. I think we can just make immense progress very quickly. Oh, and my grandfather, not my father, but my grandfather also changed his name. He was Humberto Villegas, and Humberto's not a common name, so they put Robert on his American documents. And I only found out that wasn't his name when many years later he died, and my mom and I went to Mexico City, and on his death certificate had his name. And I'm like, that's not Grandpa Robert's name. And it was the same thing. So I think that's a very common story that a lot of maybe a little older generation experienced, that need to kind of, or requirement. And maybe it was a need to fit in.
For sure. I have a similar story. My grandmother was the national vice president of LULAC, which is the League of United Latin American Citizens. I've told Joelle this story, and my father was not allowed to speak Spanish. So I don't speak Spanish naturally. And it's something that we all regret, but it was part of that. You're white enough that you can probably fit in as long as you pretend like you are not Hispanic. And it's a blight on our record, and it really tamped down, I think, a whole generation of folks and all of the things that we could have contributed had we had that legacy. So, Harry, you're our cleanup crew again.
It's one of the points Stefanie raised I'd like to continue to expand on is the concept of accountability. And accountability really has two aspects to it. You have the corporate company, private side accountability, and you have the individual accountability. And having spent most of my career in that boardroom, it starts at the top. And it starts with the board members, it starts with the CEO, and it starts with his or her executive team. And it's about holding everyone accountable. Investors holding the board accountable, the board holding the CEO accountable, and the CEO holding the executive team accountable. And you know they can work. One of the prime examples is Ariel Investments. If you're not familiar with them, you can look them up, but they invest in a lot of mid-sized companies, and they just recently started about a year ago putting pressure on companies in their portfolio to diversify their board because they understood the value that would deliver. And they understood that it would increase performance of the companies. It would bring valuable perspectives to the table. And today they have 41 companies with diverse boards today. SurveyMonkey has said, their CEO said, we're going to have a diverse supply chain. And if you're not diverse or you're not going to commit to diversity, we'll find another partner. And lastly, I'll bring Rosalind Brewer, who was the former CEO of Sam's Club, one of the very, very few African-American women ever to lead an organization of that size. She's now COO of Starbucks. But when she stepped in, she was very intentional about creating an executive team that was diverse. And when she was there, half her team, she had 50% of her team was diverse. And so this idea that there's not a pipeline and that there aren't qualified women and qualified minorities, she already proved that wrong. So I think that's important. The other part I think is critically important, and it's really important at the time we're in, is about individual accountability. There's this goal and this rush, and it's the right intention to create cultural fluency in the boardroom and on business teams and in business units. That's really hard to do if you haven't created cultural fluency in your own living room. And it starts with the individual and what's in your heart. And you have to look at what are your inner circles, what are your business circles, what are your social networks, what activities are you involved in, where do your kids go to school, and what neighborhood do you live in? And these all, and if you look at all that, does that represent what you want your company to represent in terms of diversity? And I think these are really tough discussions, and it's a really tough reality. And sometimes that question I just asked is actually rhetorical, because at the end of the day, individuals walk into those office doors to form the company, or in today's world, we sign up to Zoom, but it's the individual that comes to be part of the team. And if there's not a commitment at the individual level to have diversity in your life, it's going to be very difficult to bring that into a company.
Absolutely. No truer words were ever spoken. And Harry, I know you live that. So thank you. All right. The final question before we get to any Q&A is about impact. So what results have you seen when we effectively moved women and minorities into leadership positions? And Joelle, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, so I thank you for sharing some personal stories, Stefanie and Katica, because this work is very personal for me. When the founders of the LLI talked to me about their vision, I didn't think I was up for the job. In fact, I didn't know why they were even looking at me to come and run this institute and build this institute. And I walked across the street and I had a conversation with my grandfather that day, and he was losing his battle to cancer. My grandfather was a teenage father who went to try to apply for a job. And because his last name was Martinez, wouldn't even get an interview and was told that he wasn't going to get an interview because of his name. So he ended up spending his whole career as a labor union representative and would retire as a global vice president of a major international labor union. And he told me that the work that needs to be done is not just to change the minds and the hearts of other individuals, but a lot of the work has to be done internally. That we have these narratives running in our head that we're not good enough. And I was falling victim to that imposter syndrome, thinking that I wasn't good enough to start this institute. So the work that we do at the LLI is understanding that sometimes the barriers, these great institutional barriers, are actually far deeper and more complicated inside of each one of us. You know, we've been told things, society tells us things, we fall victim to our own stereotype threat. So our work to develop Latino leaders really focuses in on that, developing people from the inside out and making sure that we are connecting their potential and the opportunity that they can bring to the table with a great deal of social capital and emotional control and understanding that they are extraordinary. And sometimes just that acknowledgement unleashes it. So at the LLI, we've had 9 cohorts in 6 years, and we've trained individuals across sectors and industries. Our very own Denver Chief of Police, Paul Pazin, actually became Chief of Police while in our program. But we also have helped elevate people to corporate boards and others. And regardless of where we've helped elevate them to, the response is always the same. One, for themselves, they are living their full potential. They are raising their voice. They are being innovative. They are opening the door to create opportunities for others so that there's more reflective leadership across the board. And for the organizations that they go on to represent, we are getting nothing but positive feedback about their contributions and how impactful they are in developing comprehensive strategies. So I really do believe that, you know, overcoming systemic institutional barriers is one thing and part of it, but really we have to do a lot of internal work to prepare ourselves as well. And that's been the biggest success for us.
Thanks, Joelle. Pete, you've had similar stories with Greenhouse Scholars. Do you want to share some of those experiences on impact?
Yeah, you bet, Sandy. I just want to start by referencing some things that Katica and Harry said about people and culture as well. I just want to, on the culture piece, I want to say that I think not only is it important that it's intentional, which is the point that Katica made that I sure agree with, I think it's also relentlessness with regard to culture. People are relentless often about their balance sheet and other things, and culture kind of drifts in and out of their attention span. I think great companies, people that are in tech companies that are listening and participating in the panel, if you want to be able to tell if you're going to be at a company that's going to be great, are the things that they're saying about diversity, about inclusion, about, as a point that was made, I think by Stefanie, about individuals being celebrated inside of a culture. Are they just talking about it at the annual meeting, or is it coming up, you know, consistently and my word, relentlessly? Because I think that's just so critical to the whole thing. I think it's, for me, I think it's about people, and so in terms of, you know, the idea of business success and why it matters to a tech company, I think it's always about people, getting the right fit people, as a company, supporting them to be successful. And I think it just shows right back up, not only on the balance sheet, but in the quality of the work, which I think is different than just the idea of, are the numbers where they need to be? And so for us, we actually made a decision 15 years ago when we said, you know, interestingly, how connected it is to today in terms of equality and equity. Our starting place was, how do we get to a level playing field for young folks? What are we going to design to create that situation. And so we believe that we have limited resources. We're not a large organization. We're a national organization, but we're tiny in terms of our resources. We rely significantly on hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. So what we have decided is we're going to work with the lowest resource communities, most high performing, most inspiring young people, high performing across a whole bunch of different metrics, with leadership at the center. And we do believe that we're playing the long game, and that these folks are the ones that are going to inspire everybody coming from behind them, the younger people in those communities, changing communities' perspectives about what's possible when you think about this idea of being able to level the playing field. So at the end of the day, we think if you can work within these communities as opposed to coming in from the outside, we're just here to support and enable the natural leadership and other qualities that these people have. And now we've got about 9 years, 10 years of, 10 years of graduates, and all the things that we're able to support that they're doing now that they have the resources, the connections, the networks to go back into communities they came from or where they live now and say, I'm gonna be a part of this change, and we're supporting them with money to start programs and projects and do very specific, very quantifiable things. At the end of the day, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that culture is about people. The idea of what company you work at, pay attention to what they do as it relates to their culture, and as to whether you're going to be at a great company that's actually going to perform behind the things that they talk about. And our goal is to prepare these people that are going to go do great things in their companies and in their communities. And so that's what we focus on, is the people aspect of how to do really high quality work and to create great companies.
If I have the privilege of mentoring some of the folks that have gone through Greenhouse Scholars, and I will tell you they are brilliant, and have tried to get them to come back and work for Zayo, and I'm going to continue being relentless on that as well. I want those scholars to come in. That was my recruiting pitch. All right.
Sandi, real quick, you have a Greenhouse Scholar named Melly that started last week, and he's moving at Zayo, and he's moving out. He's working remotely right now, but he's moving out from Chicago in about 5 days, and he's going to stay with my wife and I for the first couple of weeks while he's looking for a place. So you have a recent example of somebody starting out with you.
He's actually on my team, so we're very happy to have him.
Fantastic.
Awesome. Harry.
Let me unmute myself. It's interesting because I keep coming back to this. We talk about people, as Pete said, and I know that Joel and LLI and Stefanie spend a lot about how the brain works and from a neuroscience perspective. And I keep coming back to that because the data's there and the results are there, and we'll continue to add to that. But that in of itself doesn't necessarily change individual human behavior. And we're still dealing with individuals in very powerful positions. And candidly, we're still predominantly dealing with white men in decision-making positions. And so I still come back to the challenge of how do you change the perspective and the thinking and the mind of an individual? An example that I use is, and it's not 100%, but if you look at athletes, for example, they tend to have a very different perspective because very early in life, they started colliding with people different than them. Race, gender, and economics. So it becomes this natural thing, right? And we do a lot of the trainings, and they're really, really necessary, and we put people in them, but you also want to surround that with more of a natural interaction, because that's what changes minds and people over time. I also think the same thing when I think of the armed forces and Army brats that move around the world, and you talk to them, and for the most part, they've been in environments, gender, race, LGBTQ, whatever it is, and they've interacted with that. And so it becomes very natural, and they have a very kind of broad perspective, and they have a very high level of emotional intelligence. And I only say that to say, then the challenge still is to those in decision-making positions to have the courage to step out of their comfort zone. And because they get to spend most of their time in their comfort zone. And I use prime examples. If you're a white male business leader, why don't you join the National Black MBA Association or the Black or the Hispanic or the Women's Chamber and be a significant contributor? Because while we do everything else we're talking about, there still needs to be this natural human interaction, because over time, that really changes the way that you think and you approach other people.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that, because we don't necessarily encourage those cross memberships into our organizations. So how do we bring everyone in to each organization? That's a great point, Harry. All right, Stefanie.
So I've already revealed my love of data, but I'm not going to talk about data. I'm going to tell a story. And I really, Sandi, wonder how you do your like full-time C-suite job when you're volunteering at Greenhouse Scholars. And I'm going to share my story of you coming to my Women in Business class. Because this isn't a data story, but it's like something that I've seen. And it's maybe 4 years ago, I created a class called Women in Business. And I think now we call it Women in Leadership, but we basically have 20 women. They come in and we bring in these extraordinary women leaders from the community, but also from across the country. And by the end of the class, we see that imposter syndrome kind of goes away. It's like everyone just needs to see themselves in a leader to see like, oh, I could do that. And in the beginning of the semester, the students say like, well, you know, I might want to have a family, and like, I don't know if I fit, like, I'm not really that assertive. And it's like, well, there's lots of different paths, right? Not everyone follows the same path. And you're picturing a really like, this is how all the men who come to your class tell their story, right? And so we have women come tell their story. And then all of a sudden, women are like, wow, like I can see myself in Sandi. And I think especially in Sandi, because I think you have such an openness that you shared your real story with people, and not, you know, I'm very intentional to ensure that my students have diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. No, not gender, because we pretty much only have women, but also socioeconomic status. And so I think a lot of, I'll say for myself, you know, I grew up really poor, and I think it's hard when you go from poor to not poor to imagine going from poor to like extremely wealthy or something like that, right? And so seeing those examples, I think helps students see themselves in the future leaders. And I'll say something to Harry's point. I said we only have women in the class, and we had one man for one day and a couple of years ago, and he dropped the class because he said, it's weird. It's like all women and me. And the women in the class were like, yeah, my economics class has all men and me. My Calc 3 class has all men and me. And so I think if your, you know, majority group member like took that risk and even went to dinner with a group of all Black or all Muslim or all women and got to experience that, then it might like kind of make sense to them what other people experience every day.
It's interesting how normal that sounds. Oh, he felt like he was out of place, right? And that's an okay way for him to feel and to opt out. But, you know, we're asked every day to show up, no matter how we feel in those situations, and lean in, right? He wasn't leaning in. So let's get his number. We'll get him into another class. Katica.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Like, welcome to what we experience almost every single day. I haven't talked about going from being a corporate executive where like 68%, maybe it's 70% now of the leadership is white male, to a venture-backed company where 97% of the folks that I am pitching are white and male. And I'm also pitching a gender equity solution. So there's that whole thing as well. Anyway, yeah, like I can't count how many times I've been told that I don't look like a tech CEO. I don't know what a tech CEO looks like, but I'm a former programmer who's fluent in 4 programming languages, but okay. Anyway, so impact, you know, I talked about the big study that we did that our platform is based on. That is for every 10% increase in gender equity, there's a 1 to 2% increase in revenue. What we've actually found, and I talked about breaking that down to the 3 key decisions that companies really make across their talent each year, which is performance, potential, and pay. What we have found through our implementations with our customers is that actually in the first 3 months on the platform, they actually improve what we have. It's called a pipeline score. It measures your journey toward intersectional gender equity by 65% in 3 months. That's the power of using technology and taking all these little decisions as a collective and moving them forward. And of course, we also quantify that in terms of their revenue and how much we can correlate to that. And for most of our customers, that's millions of dollars in revenue because they tend to be larger companies. I think the other thing, you know, and Harry talked about this in the beginning about, you know, it's not a pipeline problem. You know, we have found that too in terms of our hiring is actually internal hiring. So it's about mobility. Part of what we do when we onboard new companies is we actually create skills profiles for every employee that you have. So when a company posts a job requisition, we actually find internally for 86% of all job requisitions that are posted, we find 5 or more qualified internal candidates. So it's not a pipeline problem. The candidates are there. People are qualified. It's just that we don't think that they are. And so those are some of the things that we've seen. I think one last thing I just wanted to mention was that, you know, there's a fair amount of time, not this conversation today, but sort of in general about closing the gender pay gap, which is important, don't get me wrong. But one of the things that we've found is that pay is the symptom, it's not the disease. And what I mean by that is pay is the quantitative value that we place on our talent, but the actual value that we place in our talent happens before that in performance and potential. So one of the things that Pipeline does when we go into companies, for instance, who are looking just to ensure equitable pay, is we actually implement performance, potential, and pay so that we're ensuring that you're actually valuing your employees equitably. We've actually found on average, companies have bias in 1/3 of all their performance reviews. And then the potential actually being developed for future leadership positions. And those inputs are very important to ensuring equitable pay.
And there's one thing you didn't talk about, but when we first met and we talked about sales teams.
Yes.
I know you're working with Salesforce on something, but we found that sales teams, women and perhaps minorities, aren't getting the same accounts as the average white guy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. So one of our key KPIs is actually carrying a quota. It's why we launched the first gender equity app on the Salesforce App Exchange. But what we found is that when you assign leads and opportunities and territories, that's actually not done equitably. So kind of if you think about the glass cliff for women who are in senior, you know, essentially they go into really difficult situations, that actually happens in sales teams. The issue is a couple of things. One is that it's really hard to be promoted to a CEO role if you haven't carried a bag. I mean, if you haven't carried a quota, it's very difficult. But also that gender diverse sales teams actually far outperform their non-gender diverse peers. Once you hit that 44% mark of gender diversity on a sales team, it's like double the amount of sales, double the amount of market share. They just blow past the competition. And so it's a very important lever for a couple of reasons. One, to ensure the revenue producing function in your organization is actually top performing, coupled with what is our future pipeline of CEOs, of C-suite members, of board members. Couple that with the fact that actually sales has the second largest gender gap in leadership, second only to supply chain and logistics, and it's a really key area for companies to look at.
Thanks so much for sharing that. So does anyone else have comments before we go to questions? Anyone? Okay, perfect. All right, this first question is interesting, and it's not something that we spoke about today, but I'm sure we have an opinion on it. Can you speak to how you support diversity and inclusion when it comes to neurodiversity and disability? Who'd like to take that question? And Joelle.
So first, I like to make sure we define so that everyone knows. When we talk about neurodiversity, we are specifically talking about the way people are wired to think. So things like autism and ADHD and some of these characteristics that are neurological in nature. And that neurodiversity comes really into play in technology, especially because there's a lot of studies about autism and coders. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about that. I will say that it is not, you don't normally see that being included in DE&I conversations at large. I think generally speaking, most of them still focus in on external diversity dimensions like race and gender and religion and those types of things. So I don't think that this gets discussed enough. However, I think particularly in the tech industry, you're seeing more and more HR organizations, HR within the organizations, do work around this because they know that this is critically important for their workforce recruitment and retention and ultimate development. But it's just it's not normally seen in typical DE&I work, at least not in my experience.
Gotcha. Does anyone else have anything to add?
No, I would add, I haven't seen it either. As Joelle said, I think it will take something intentional. The closest that I can think of is my son has Asperger's, so he was diagnosed with autism at age 3. And today he actually is a civil engineer, and he came up through CU Boulder. But CU Boulder actually has a very specific program that is included within their minority students in the engineering program, men and women. And within that, they have some resources they put into their Gold Shirt program. And then they continue to work with companies if companies are willing to. So I'm saying in this particular one is something that is absolutely needed, and it's actually critical. There's a way software engineers, for example, think that has some aspects that are very similar to the way that people talk about Asperger's and autism, but it will take some partnerships between the private sector. I don't think they're not equipped today to do this without reaching into organizations that have expertise. But if they're willing to do that, I think there's a really nice bridge that can be built.
And I think it's a great question. I'm really glad that you brought it up. And that question was anonymous. So the next question comes from Pat Cope. In engineering, we talk about moving to the left, starting the process earlier. How do we move to the left, encouraging the youngest and most diverse individuals to dream bigger, get into schools earlier, change media images to be more inclusive? Any ideas on what an individual can do? Pete?
Well, I just, I think I want to focus on the part about it that has to do with people dreaming bigger. Or I guess in my way of thinking about it, dreaming in a way that's unencumbered. And so one of the things that we do with the young folks in college that we work with is we help them put together what we call an impact plan. And it's for their lives as individuals. And so, it's just this sort of intentional approach to objectives and strategies and tactical, actionable things that they might want to do. And we make sure they understand that it's not about the next 4 years. And frankly, it's not about the plan being right. And it's not about achieving everything that you put on the plan. It's about having a plan. And so, in our view, if you want to get people to kind of figure things out in a way where they can start to be unencumbered about how big things can be for them, whatever their definition personally is. We believe that there's something to be said for as a component, not the answer, to have an intentional individual approach to what you want your impact to be in the world. And, when you look back and you're 100 years old, or in the case of younger generations, 165 years old, and you say, what did I do with my time? What did I do in my career? What did I do in my family and personal life, and so on and so forth? I think it starts to open people's minds to have early on thoughts and goals about what they can or might want to accomplish if they aren't feeling like they have to achieve everything that's on the page, that it can change, it can evolve. So I think that the whole moving to the left thing for me is helping people understand early on that they do have a say, that they can strongly impact their own lives by having certain goals and working toward them in a very persistent manner.
Awesome. Thanks, Pete. Anyone else want to chime in? Katica?
Yeah, I do.
Katica, sorry.
I think, I talked about what we tell little girls, right? That they can be anything they want to be as long as they work hard and do well in school. And then they get to the workplace and that's not what they experience, right? And so the other piece of that, I think there's two. One is that we need to arm our kids and young folks with the tools to understand what happens when they're being gaslit or when they're being mansplained or any of the things that that happens to them. I truly, because the first time I heard the term mansplaining, I was like, that's what's happening. I could never figure out, like, I'd sit in some male executive's office and I was like, why is he explaining this to me? I know what this is. And when I heard that term, I was like, I get it. We talk about how, I think, Stefanie, it's so interesting. I went to an all girls boarding school. And so I had that transition into like mixed gender classrooms. And it was so different, that we, girls aren't just less confident, like they're not born less confident, they're socialized less confident, right? I have a little girl, she's 9, and she, and my son is 13, and no one ever commented on how he looked when he was little. No one did. And when she was little, people would say, oh, she's so cute. And I taught her to say, and I'm smart too, because I wanted her to, oh, you hear me? They froze.
Well, unfortunately, with that, we are actually out of time. So thank you all. I'm eternally grateful to you. Let me know if there's ever anything I can do for you, for your organizations. I appreciate you, and I'm sure everyone who heard you also appreciates you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.